Hello, everyone. I'm Rafael Chacon. I'm the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and it is a pleasure to welcome you back to Bookish Reveals. This is the fifth installment in a seven-part program in which we discuss the genre of the artist book. But first, it's important to acknowledge that the Montana Museum of Art and Culture is on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, and today we honor the path they have always showed us in caring for this place for generations to come. To which we add at the museum that art has always been a part of this place. We also want to send out a shout out to all our healthcare professionals and first responders making extraordinary sacrifices in this time of crisis for our nation. So before I describe today's exciting program and introduce our guest speakers, allow me to thank our generous sponsors, the Montana Arts Council and Humanities Montana, whose distribution of CARES Act support has made much of this program possible. So we're presently broadcasting from locations across the country, but this program coincides with an exhibition at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture in Missoula, Montana. And that show is titled Bookish Selections from the Dan Weinberg Collection. The show runs until December 12th in the Henry Malloy Gallery at the University of Montana's PARTV Center. This is an extraordinary exhibition. It features a remarkable array of illustrated books by notable artists and authors. All of these are the work of New York City publisher Vincent Fitzgerald. We hope you can visit this beautiful exhibition, and if not, you can check out a virtual tour at our webpage, and that's umt.edu/Montana Museum, umt.edu/Montana Museum. There are videos, by the way, of all of these bookish reveals, and the books themselves open page by page, and those are posted on the museum's YouTube channel. So it is a pleasure to introduce to you two remarkable human beings. Today's guests are a remarkable team, celebrated poet Elizabeth Bradfield and visual artist Antonia Contro. They have the hour to discuss their marvelous collaboration, and this is their new book. It's a new artist book titled Theorem. When they're finished with the presentation, we'll read questions from the audience. So I want to invite you to use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to read your questions aloud. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel if you wish to return to it or share it with friends. And I would ask that you mute yourselves during the presentation. So, writer-naturalist Elizabeth Bradfield is the author of Once Removed, Approaching Ice, Interpretive Work, and Toured Antarctica, which combines her photographs with brief hybrid essays. Her work has been published in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. She is the winner of the Audre Lorde Prize, the finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, and the James Laughlin Award. And her awards also include a Stegner Fellowship and a Breadloaf Scholarship. Elizabeth is the founder and editor-in-chief of the innovative monthly Broad-Sided Press. She works as a naturalist and guide and teaches creative writing at Brandeis University. Antonia Contro, our second guest, is a visual artist whose compelling work ranges from discrete objects to site-specific installations and concept-based collaborations that engage artists and practitioners from a variety of disciplines. Her art explores the nature of knowledge, memory, and time. Her exhibitions include Tempus Fugit at Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society Museum, Closed Open at Chicago's Newberry Library, and Descry at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. Her work is in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art, Harvard University Museums, among many others. Contro was awarded a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship and an Illinois Arts Council Fellowship, and is an honorary doctorate in humanities from Lewis University. Their collaboration, Theorem, was published last year by Candor Arts as a fine art book in a limited edition of 30, and released this fall in a trade edition by Poetry Northwest Editions. The fine art version, and incidentally, there are links to both of those publications in the chat box currently. The fine art version of the book is now in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Brandeis University, LA's Hammer Museum, Harvard University, the Mental Collection, Stanford University, and the University of Arizona Poetry Center, as well as in the hands of many private collectors. As Elizabeth Bradfield wrote, it has been, quote, a true collaboration, a singular piece built through time and conversation. It would be impossible to extract text from image, image from text. The words' works do not illustrate each other, but rest alongside one another, speaking to one another, creating a greater whole. And on that note, it is a pleasure to welcome Antonia and Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Rafael. And I think what we'd like to do is begin with the text, the images, the physicality of Theorem. And again, for both Antonia and myself, as an experience that engages the book, as a question that investigates the book, both of us have contributed to the moment that is Theorem, and both of our experiences in writing, in images, have been a guiding force in moving us forward to this final collaboration. So I'm going to begin with a reading of, showing of Theorem that that holds both of Antonia's images and my story. And then I hope we can talk more about that, about our coming together as writers, as artists, as collaborators. And we're very interested in what you're all curious about in the conversation to come. So story time begins first. And here is Theorem. At 13, I fell in love with the tidy solutions of geometry. Neat in my notebooks, they made architecture of chaos, denoted all I could not allow myself to say, contained it in measurable forms. Yet something pulsed, formulas and proofs, or fingers caged around a bright, quick thing, trapped but not bruised, not even close, but bruisable, a sort of bird. This is a story of secrets, of a secret, of becoming along and from them. What could allow me to touch myself, my secrets, safely? Even now, they have power. As for one, something had begun to flow through my body's passages. If I opened my hands, what would be revealed? I knew. Dark matter, strange attractions, an unknown universe. Was it safe? I didn't know. But stars shone there. I sensed them. And they were not tired, told fate, but projected escape. A math-made map. A sky blanketing that could open and open to the breathless, unheld. There were 5 of us, plus the dog and the dog that died, no others. I was one of 3 sisters. For so long, I didn't know what shape I was. Did I have to have one? I learned the horizon's distance could be calculated by my height above sea level. The oldest, first to emerge, I was looking at a different distance than my sisters, or the same view, differently. I know, so are they. I did not know what, aside from me, was precarious. But physics tells us that once in motion, even the smallest things, given length of run and type of terrain, can carve huge swaths. We grew into other complications, more complex math. Our mother kept track of us on a tug company calendar hung inside the ironing board cupboard. Each boxed day was marked with the tide sine curve, predictable flood and ebb rising and falling across the weeks. But don't forget, all this was created by the moon. To cube is to find a 3 of x. It is to leave the planar, the plane, thus permitting shadow. Our edges touched, our stories abutted, the same light struck us in different times. Something was on approach from elsewhere. I was known as a secretive child. Not at first, but later, maybe starting then. I could not find what was growing in me within any of the books on the shelves of our house. There was no guide available. I could not identify either what was growing in me, growing in my sisters beside me, or how, or why, or into what. Photomorphs, we grew differently, even as our roots all pulled from the same soil. I grew up on the wet side of Western mountains. I don't really remember rain. I was very good at forgetting. I still am. I grappled with rum lines, arced routes that look longer on the map, but my dad said actually take less time to travel. The math worked, but storms still howled out of who knows where, shifting the courses of even large ships. How are my sisters navigating? I didn't even think to wonder. No flat map shows the world's true shape. We mislearn extremities and peripheries from the start. What else have I erased? How can I know? This is the only way I can write about it, the only way I will. I promise. One secret has stepped out into light, has long glowed luminous. How ridiculous now, its early, confused fear. The other is not mine to tell. A dark, dense absence, a singularity. It can only measure what it has bent, the adjustments made to avoid its pull. It ghosts me. Is there a truth it holds? Too close for any perspective or clarity? How can I ever know? Look, I can pretend to see things two ways, but the gut is singular and stubborn. It knows what it first knew as true. There is one form, one story, one vessel I keep seeing. And really, it is two stories, two cubed, unfolding at once, recombinant, folding into and through each other, forging a unique amalgam. There were 5 of us, plus the dog and the dog that died. Only one dog at a time, no others. The results are fractal, the trajectories radiate. Something happened to me, and yet not to me. It divides, absolutely. What was created in its chaos, light, dust, shadow, for me, for my sisters, for us all? I am still trying to map it. I am still trying to calculate what can be traced to its red-shifted source. And that's the end of the story of Theorem, but only the beginning of our conversation. So thank you. I suppose I'd like to invite Antonia to say more, or find a way to move us forward into other investigations.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for that beautiful reading. Again, Rafael, thank you for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here and with all of you to talk about this extraordinary engagement that Liz and I have had for, my God, I think 3 years now, nearly. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how this came to be. I have known Liz for many years, and we consider ourselves both deep friends, dear friends, and we've been so interested in each other's work, and I've always sensed this aesthetic synchronicity. And I think that perhaps even since the first moment we met, we started to imagine what it might be like to work on something in partnership. But because of the way we were so in awe of each other and each other's work, we were very cautious about finding what we had to know was the right project. I, as an artist, try to take a month each year to just go away, retreat, alone with myself. And for many years, I've done that on Cape Cod, where Liz lives. And so we've had these perennial reunions where we talk about art and writing and ideas. And in 2017, when I was there, I had brought along with me one of my own artist books, in this case, a book that was a prototype for an animated film I was working on. More on that in a moment. But I felt intuitively that this was the piece to share with Liz. And I presented it to her, and indeed, it struck a chord with her. And we'll talk a bit more about how Theorem came to be physically as a result of that serendipitous moment. So we're going to show you a few more slides here. Liz is going to drive. And also, just in advance, my studio where I am is on Chicago's L. And so from time to time, you're going to hear that. You'll definitely hear that go by, and please bear with me. So the first image we're going to show you is of the fine art edition.
Yeah, and I think it would be sorry, it would be great to talk about this a little bit. So Theorem has been, I shared with you the text and images of Theorem, but it's had a few different lifetimes. And first, it was this beautiful fine art edition published by Candor Arts with this handcrafted wrap, an embossed cover, an edition of 30, and with letterpressed pages, but that wasn't exactly where we began in many ways. So, Antonia.
Yeah, so this takes us back to the original book that I shared with Elizabeth. This was, a handmade, a hand-sewn artist book that was created actually to serve as a model for this animated movie that called Ex Libris that I showed in an exhibition in Chicago at Chicago's Cultural Center. And a couple of, Liz, can we see the image of it open? A real, what became a really core element of, and Liz can talk to this, what triggered something in her to write this piece, but also structurally was necessary for the way in which this film was made, but that we ultimately wanted to carry into the fine art edition. It was this change in the scale of the signatures or of the pages. So as one went through the book, the pages became smaller and smaller. They winnowed into this very concentrated small size at the end.
Yeah, and that from the time that Antonia gave me this book and said, "Hey, shall we collaborate with this? Um, and of course I said yes, with trepidation, with worry about what that might mean, and curiosity about the private creation and then the further public form. But that idea of the physicality of the book, as you can see here, getting smaller and smaller, was always so much a part of my process in making it. And I'll show you here. I spent some time after Antonia and I were together on the Cape. She gave me the book. She went back to Chicago, and then I spent some time just really thinking and imagining, and I was very lucky on Cape Cod to have a little bit of time in one of the dune shacks at the Cape, to which is a place apart in so many ways. And I think places apart are so critical to creative imagining. And so when I had that time, I was thinking about those shapes of the folios. I was thinking about the reducing of those sizes and what that might mean to whatever I would write. So that was formative from the beginning for me, and in addition to Antonia's images, but in some ways even more than her images. That idea of something getting smaller and smaller, not less and less consequential, but more and more concentrated, was really interesting to me as a writer, as a maker.
So I think what we then began after I had left the Cape and left this book with Elizabeth, probably about 6 months later in the mail, I received my book back with Liz's writing, first draft of what was to become Theorem. And it was such an electric moment for me to see how she had responded to this. And it really was then that we began in earnest, and over the arc of many months and now years, to shape and craft this book. I'd like to show a slide of us working in our various studios. This was an instance even before COVID, when having electronic ways and digital ways of communicating across the miles was critical. You can see how Liz had laid out the book on her office wall, and in my studio, I used my work table, and we would often have these phone conversations, well, really via FaceTime, to discuss the relationships between text and image, the maybe resorting or reconsidering of those things. And I just like to also say, sort of parenthetically for a moment, that I mean, ultimately, Theorem, this is one other demonstration of how Theorem is really ultimately about relationships. And so in the shot in my studio, this was our first meeting with our publishers, Candor Arts, a fine art publishing press in Chicago, actually published the book, and we were really thrilled to work with them because of their extraordinary craftsmanship, attention to detail, and in this case, their ability to retain, to bind the book with these winnowing signatures, or this change in the scale of the pages, which was quite a feat.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that, so once I sent the text back to Antonia, there was a long back and forth, even before we talked to a publisher about what would this look like and what images needed to be changed, what text needed to be changed, so that this could be a whole that we both believed in. And I think it's there that the true collaboration came into place. And I think people talk about collaboration in terms of, in a lot of different ways, but I've had a lot of different collaborations, and I know Antonia has also, but I think that for us, that back and forth and that questioning that really for me at the beginning was very terrifying. Like, what if you took this image out? Felt like a really, that felt like a bold, obstreperous question. But once that conversation on both of our sides was broached, then I think we really came into what we wanted to have for Theorem as a whole, because both of us needed to pull things in, get rid of things, move things around, and we were actively engaged in that together as collaborators.
Here we come to another image of the book finished. And one of the things that we decided as we moved towards the final iteration of our work was that rather than encase the book in a traditional clamshell box, because of what it was about in so many ways, both its content and you know, my interest in materials and the haptic, we decided that we really wanted to encase it in a cloth wrap. And this led us, I just want to note, to expanding our pool of partners, of other extraordinarily skilled artists who helped us actualize this vision we had. I want to just shout out a shout out to Marina Contro, a spectacular weaver who actually agreed to create this very thin piece of ribbon, irregular ribbon, to attach to each wrap, which mimicked, which restated this black line, which we'll talk about a bit, which really in many ways was visually and thematically the major protagonist in Theorem.
And thinking about this idea of from Antonia's images to the text I wrote to this other iteration, how could we physically convey the emotionality that it felt like to us? And to us, that idea of something being wrapped, of being unfolded, of being secret and held away was so important. And so what you're looking at now is this beautiful red wrapped iteration of Theorem with an embossed cover. The line kind of rises up, and then and you open up this cloth wrap to engage the beautiful book of Theorem. And that unfolding and unfolding was so much a part of the idea of discovering secrets, understanding or not what it might mean to investigate. And then once with Candor, we started working with a publisher to have these beautiful, it's a big like 12 by 12 book in the fine art edition. We had letterpress on the pages. There was no facing between image and text. They were moving slowly as you experienced. And then each section which you experienced a bit in my reading, got smaller and smaller. And it does physically in that fine art book, and in the trade edition, it's suggested graphically. But that idea of something beginning large and then surprisingly moving toward a smaller concentration was so important to both of us. And then thinking about the moments in which that gradual progression might be interrupted by the fold out of this moment, or by a particular hand. How would you say that, Antonia?
Well, yeah, I really wanted to. So much of my work is about is collage and integrates collage, and I really wanted. We both wanted to retain some of that, even in the editioned books.
So there are moments in the book, in the fine art edition, that are hand touched by Antonia, and we thought a lot about what moments might feel right to do that with in terms of the narrative, and also graphically what might be interesting, because we wanted both the tactile sense and the narrative sense to be moving together in the fine art edition, in that book art edition.
Yeah, so I also, so this gives you a sense where I hand drew a line there onto the back of the page. I continued this line, this kind of nod to a continuing horizon line there, and then punched out a hole in one page so that writing would emerge from the page behind it. Yeah, I also, took some different colored pencils and drew a line, or like drew along the interior of that cutout, so that over time, the residue, the shadow of that color shows up on the text. I also want to say this, and then I know that we need to move along, because we want to hear Rafael's questions and yours in the audience as well. But one thing that we were able to do, and was really meaningful to us in this edition that you're seeing here, is have, except for like a key moment, have single text pages and single image pages, giving each of our work and each of our disciplines, the same amount of weight. In this book, the visual work does not illustrate the text, nor does the text illustrate the images, but they coexist in dynamic partnership. That was important to us.
Yeah, and I think what we hope, both in the fine art edition, what you're seeing here, and also in the trade edition, is that there's a back and forth, that you see an image, you read the text, and then you go back and you go forward, and between that motion, it's not a linear progression, right? There's a really important back and forth. There's an important moving forward, considering back, that is part of the experience of the book and what's being conveyed. And I think, honestly, I think that's true of our lived experiences also. It's not linear, right? It's not us moving forward from one experience to the next, but there's this back and forth that's so rich, and that helps us understand the context and nuance of our memory, our experiences, our perceptions. And that's one thing that we hope to evoke in Theorem.
Rafael, I wonder if this, I think this is maybe the time that we let you take over here.
Thank you. And thanks for that fantastic reading, Elizabeth, and the visualization as well, and your explanations of both the history and the structure of this marvelous book. So I have a couple of questions, and they're really they're grouped. One are a series of questions related to process, and then questions related to content. And those might be inseparable. So so bear with me. My first question, I guess, is, and maybe this already has come through the presentation, but I'd like to talk more explicitly about it, and that is that what came first? Was it Elizabeth's words or Antonia's images? Or does that even matter? And I think you might have been sort of dancing around that explanation even before I started asking the question. So does text precede image and vice versa?
I'll start, and Liz, you join in. The first exchange was of the images. The images were given to Elizabeth, and she wrote to them.
Okay. So really, the most of the process has been a responsive process, right? And then, of course, a kind of mutual back and forth in the construction of the book itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I'm trying to find the right image to show you that you know, Antonia showed me, as she said, this beautiful book that was winnowed already, and I started thinking about it and wondering about it, and then Antonia went back to Chicago, and I stayed here on Cape Cod, and yet there was this, and that time apart from one another, and that time disassociating ourselves, like honoring each other and knowing each other's artistic intent, and then also trying to be two separate voices that are coming into communion was really important. So I had this time apart at this dune shack, and it was away from my home life, and it was away from Antonia, and it was away from everything. And that's when I started writing and started thinking about Theorem most seriously. And even from then, from her images, that idea of the pages winnowing, the pages getting smaller, was so important and critical. And when I sent my images or my text to Antonia, I was nervous. I didn't know, you know, what would she think of what story I'd affixed to her narrative. And I think the benefit of Theorem is that both of us allowed ourselves a lot of time to explore before this was actualized, right? To see what would happen before we're like, yes, we will make a thing. And that time to drift and wonder, for me, was very freeing.
And I would say clearly there's the what this book did for both of you, and the transformative power of working on a collaboration like this. But I also think that in some ways you're also playing with the genre and the tradition of this is that you start with the text. I mean, that's the Western way, that we always start with text first, and then.
But is it? No, it's not.
That's right. But that's the common notion. That's the cliche that word always precedes the image. and that the image is the illustration. It's the response to the word. And so here what you see is this inversion, and actually it's more than just an inversion. It's a kind of like cross-pollination that then takes over, that becomes its own dynamic process. So I actually think it's so rich. So process seems to be so key to this, you know, that you gave yourselves time to work through a process, a rapport that you developed with each other. And of course it preceded the book, but it definitely becomes magnified and heightened during, right? Okay, so I hope I'm not putting words in your mouths here, but that's how I perceive this process. So let me shift a little, unless you want to add to that, but let me shift a little bit and talking about process. One is the process that you've engaged in the creation of this thing. But then there's the process of reception, the process of the viewer, the reader. And how do you envision the ideal encounter with your creation? What's the ideal setting? How is that process somehow a mirror of what you've experienced, or something different?
Well, you know, I would jump in to say that the book, you know, the fine art edition is, if I may say, it's beautiful, and it has a sense of being an art. It's an art object. So even the mere idea that you can hold it and touch it and move the pages feels a little bit invasive. I mean, at least to, you know, somebody that's been raised in that way with art objects. But I think that it really mattered to us that people held this book, that they felt, you know, they felt the haptic qualities of the pages, of the letterpress, of the wrap, of the different elements in the book. You know, to me, a book is the act of reading a book, and of particularly of looking at this book. It's a filmic experience, and it's an invitation for the reader in turning the pages and absorbing each image and the text to participate in the unfolding of the story, and even in the making of the story, because, you know, you're having your own interpretive encounter with it. I will say this was a really extraordinary situation, in that we were approached by publishers both in the fine art world and in the trade world, so that we have both this, you know, limited edition of these fine art pieces, and there is this more democratic book now on the market that everyone can have and hold, and I think still encounter a real treasure of a book.
Yeah, and I think that the question of the physicality of that experience, and the dance between image and story. I mean, for me, I was so inspired by Antonia's images, and they're geometric images, they're spare images, they're images that reference science. And so rather than talking about science, when I wrote about them, I wanted to write about something that was intimate and personal and feeling. And they evoked from me a story that I would not have written about in any other way. Honestly, I wouldn't have. And the story of Theorem is clearly one of secrets, as it says, but not one that reveals secrets. So this is a meditative book. It's a book that asks you to think about your past, my past, your past, about images, the clearness of shapes, and what those hide and what those reveal, what we can move forward to, what it means to even turn pages and move forward and to think back into our lives. And I think that overall, Theorem asks or invites the reader to consider their own stories and the secrets they've held, and what objective meanings have offered and disallowed them, and to just be quiet with that, to open space for that consideration.
That yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, the questions of content and process really are one and the same in some ways. So both for the reader, it sounds like, as well as for you. There are a lot of allusions in both the imagery and the visual imagery and in the text to mathematics, to geometry, to maybe numerology. And in fact, the title, maybe this goes to the question of the title of the book, Theorem. Can you tell us a little bit about how that notion of mathematics engages the narratives, the stories that you're telling?
You know, the title actually, when Antonia first sent me her book, when we were looking at it, we had a different cover, a different idea. And then when Antonia and I got together in Chicago and started working on this in a deep way, we were at lunch, we were chatting, and I was like, what about Theorem? And we looked at each other, we're like, oh yeah, that's the title. And there was something about the idea of it being a postulate, right? To be something suggested, to be tested, and something about for me, the sound of it, Theorem, you hold it in your mouth. And that felt right. And the back and forth between formulas and all they can't hold was so interesting to me throughout the book.
And so what is the connection then to counting and mathematics and numbers and geometries? Because it intersects with both of your stories, both of your narratives, I think.
Yes, yes. I mean, certainly, you know, we both use that kind of imagery, not only in Theorem, but throughout our work. And for me, I think that my work is a lot about the nature of knowledge and really how we come to know what we know. And I have used representationally, I've referred to different kinds of collections of knowledge, dictionaries, encyclopedias, taxonomies, and the images within. And this idea for me that these that images from math and science can define something, can create, impart the idea of a very concrete knowledge. But I also usually try to upend that and suggest that there's much more to that definition than what a math, for me, a visual depiction of a math formula or a scientific image presents. I've also, in a self-deprecating way, I finally can do something beautiful with geometric images, considering I failed geometry in high school.
Well, and I loved geometry. I loved it. I got an A+, I think. I can't remember. Maybe it was an A, whatever. But but it wasn't geometry did not speak to me in any way, shape, or form to the difficulty I was having at the time I was studying that field. And I think there's something about theorem that allows us to acknowledge the pleasure of figuring something out mathematically and all that that disallows, all the chaos, all the emotion, all the doubt that the human body brings to these formulas. And that's what I really hope for Theorem. I mean, there's the story that's offered in Theorem itself, but I think often that in thinking about science and formulas, there's a comfort in their clarity, but we know that that comfort and that clarity is holding and hiding so much chaos and so much doubt and so much hope, despair, joy, all of those emotions. And I hope that in this book, we allow those conflicting, contradicting things to commingle.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, clearly mathematics, these systems of signage are symbolic systems, and therefore they're abstractions, and they seem to remove us to this kind of objectivity. But you guys do the opposite in this book. You take us into intimate relationship. And I do think that it's easy to think of those abstractions as somehow removing us from truth. So hiding, obscuring very complex, rich realities. And some of those are relational, they're developmental, they're very human sorts of experiences. And so it would seem that one could use mathematics, geometry, a number of systems that to distance us as humans. But what you are actually doing is you're actually inviting us to penetrate those systems, to see through the abstraction to these richer, more human, you know, existences. So yeah, respond, Liz.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, please.
I think that's right, Rafael. And Liz and I mean, I think we're drawn to these images because they coax rather than club. They suggest rather than state. And they really ideally open up the idea of interpretive possibility, of subjectivity. I think the images and words, they don't withhold in a selfish way. I mean, I've said this before, but that they suggest that the deepest of experiences are complicated and difficult and must be carefully considered, and their layers must be pulled back with measured caution. And this is what we offer in Theorem.
I think a lot about, I mean, I write also in my poems about history and about historic subjects. And I think often about history as, I talk to my students about history as a potholder, right? If you can find a historic moment that resonates with your reality, then that's a safety mechanism. It's a potholder for you to address what you're curious about. And I think in some ways, for me, Antonia's images, it sounds so stupid, but they're a potholder. And that reduces them in a way that I'm not comfortable with at all. But at the same time, they're a way to investigate questions that I would not investigate without the safety of those images as a counterbalance and a counter narrative. And I think to have something aside from your personal narrative and self as a vehicle toward understanding and investigation is incredibly valuable. And for myself and Antonia going back and forth with these images and these texts, and this is going a little bit toward the question in the chat about the collaborative editing process, we thought a lot about what would be the overall gesture of this book. How can we pace it out? What should we pull back? what should we put in? And so there was quite a bit of back and forth between Antonia and myself about images. I would ask her, what do you think about this image? Can we pull it out? And she would say, what about this image? And then I would say, oh, then I've got to write this other thing. And it took a long time for us to find the final dynamic between image and text that felt right for both of us.
Ladies, I am so sorry that we have come to the end of our program today, but I want to thank you so much for this very, very wonderful and rich experience. Thank you for introducing us to Theorem. I hope we see more of that book. So thank you so much. I will, by the way, I will close this, this recording with a screen with information on how to obtain both the fine art edition or the trade edition, even locally here in Missoula. So thank you, Antonia and Elizabeth. And I want to end by stating that our next Bookish Reveal will take place on Thursday, December 3rd at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. So please join us for a conversation with artist Audra Loyal of the Vespiary Bookbindery in Missoula. She will be revealing a group of books from the Weinberg collection with very unusual and innovative and sculptural bindings. So if you're interested in the entire program, please visit our webpage at umt.edu/Montana Museum, umt.edu/Montana Museum. Thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.